Okay, we're going to get started again with our afternoon session. This session is going to focus mainly on renewable energy. It's always fun to introduce your colleagues. Ken Metlock's new title is the James A. Baker III and Susan G. Baker Fellow for Energy and Resource Economics here at the Baker Institute. He also teaches energy economics here at Rice. He's won prizes from the International Association for Energy Economics. But the thing I like to say best about Ken is that Ken, not only now I think is the world's authority on shale gas, maybe bar none, but he's homegrown. So he was our PhD student. So my thanks for all of you from the Energy Forum. A lot of what we do with the funding from the donations that come, the membership fees that come from the Energy Forum, is we support fellowships for graduate students to help us work on the research. The first person when I came here to get a fellowship to work on energy research was Ken. And so it's really exciting for us to be able to, when people come to us and say, is your fellowship program working? It's really exciting for us to say not only, well, yes, because the energy analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency is one of our PhDs, or the vice president for commodity analysis at Citibank is one of our PhDs. It's really exciting to say our top fellow in energy resources is one of our PhDs. So with that, it's a great honor for me to introduce Ken to start off our session.
Well, thank you, Amy. That was very kind. I think I know pretty much everybody in the audience. Certainly through the course of this study, we've had a number of different workshops, and I want to first of all thank everybody who participated in those workshops for basically contributing in a major way to what we're talking about here today. The other thing I want to say is this is not work that I've done on my own. The co-author on the paper listed back there that shares the same title as this particular presentation is Peter Hartley. He and I have been co-conspirators on many different projects over the last 5 or 6 years now, and by and large it's been a very successful collaboration. Anything I say that you guys disagree with, though, I'm sure Peter will be happy that I say this. It's totally on me. So, but what I'm going to do today is emphasize, really, with regard to our particular, the broad study, emphasize the effect on renewables. But before I get there, I really want to talk a little bit about the study itself, because I think when you really want to understand why we got to a particular place, like why the results look the way they do, it's important to understand the inputs, right, and the assumptions. So rest assured, we tested a lot of these assumptions in major ways over the course of the last 3 years. I have to say, just at his face, and I have a slide that I'll show you in just a minute, probably the biggest influence on outcomes has to do with the capital costs of deploying new technologies. We started the exercise by using capital costs that are generally reported by the Department of Energy from the Office of Fossil Energy. They're used by the EIA in the analyses they do. And a lot of times, because the EIA's model is often co-opted by other organizations such as Resources for the Future, and even the data such as by groups such as MIT, that data is a pretty fundamental data set, right, when you think about analyses of this type, in particular understanding what cap and trade or carbon tax mechanisms might actually mean. But one of the things we did through the course of the workshops is we tested that data against industry participants. And with the exception of the renewable space, and I think this is actually very interesting, the DOE costs were very, very low relative to what industry representatives would indicate the cost of deploying new technologies actually is. And I think that's a very, very important takeaway from all of this. Even if you don't buy the results of the analysis or you think there's no way that'll happen, just understanding the differences between what's informing policy on the Hill and the analyses that are being done at EIA and by the DOE in particular understanding the differences in the cost that they're using and the cost that industry actually believe are realistic. I think that there's a lot of insight in that. And in a lot of ways, it helps inform the debate why there's such a divergence, really, among different groups as to what will work and what won't. Okay. By the way, I also want to mention, we are aware that the slides appear very sort of blurry, and I apologize for that, but rest assured, all of this will be available on our website immediately following the conference, so you'll be able to access all these slides, and we'll provide you a link to do so. Next, okay. So there are various things that we wanted to accomplish in this particular study, and we set about developing a new energy model. It's really very much in the vein of the Rice World Gas Trade model, which many of you may be familiar with already, which looks specifically at natural gas markets. It's a very detailed infrastructure, a very detailed model. I will talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. In particular, I want to emphasize the main study findings on natural gas markets. But we developed this Rice World Energy Model so that we could explore the influences of various policies in both a regional and international setting. And really looking at carbon tax or cap and trade type policies, that was really our first foray into this type of an exercise. Now, we decided to use a scenario approach because, quite frankly, we understand there's a lot of uncertainty around any of the parameters you want to sort of specify in any modeling exercise you do. So, again, as Amy emphasized before lunch, I'm not going to stand here and say this is a prediction of what will happen. Because if you asked us, any one of the fellows in the Baker Institute, to sort of paint a picture of the way the world ought to look and the set of assumptions we ought to make, we'd probably all have, divergent sets of assumptions. Okay, so what we try to do is inform the model with data that reflects reality today, right? Best sort of expectations about innovation, things of that nature that are informed by analyses that have been done either by Baker Institute fellows or by third parties, and then move on from there so that we can test the veracity of certain assumptions. The degree of CO2 emissions cuts, that was one of the big ones that we really wanted to look at. So are we looking for a 20% cut relative to 2005 levels by 2050, a 50% cut relative to 2005 levels by 2050? Do we allow offset trading? Is the carbon scheme U.S. only, or is it international in scope? Right, all of these things are things that we allowed for and analyzed. As I said a minute ago, the operating and capital costs of various technologies, this turns out to be a really, really important driver. Well, I'll just go ahead and skip to that in just a second. But one of the other things that I think is really probably the biggest contribution of what we did is we actually took some data that's been used, it's called the GTAP database, it's developed by some scholars at Purdue. It's been used to look at the consequences of various policies on international trade. Some of those analyses have included in their scope introduction of a carbon price in certain parts of the world, so on and so forth. But usually what you use this kind of information for is to understand the impact of a particular carbon policy on what's known as carbon leakage. So how much of carbon-intensive industry migrates from an area that is bound by a particular regime to one that's not. And it turns out that that really is, at its core, another type of offset, right? It's a way to deal with rising CO2 costs or carbon costs. You can simply migrate to another part of the world and keep producing whatever you were producing before, right? So we actually utilize that database to inform this particular analysis as well. And I'll show you some results. And Amy actually showed you a slide that had some of those in that. Some very key points. And this is why I keep emphasizing the cost of different technologies. The cost of deploying CCS, for example, if that's the lowest cost option. Let's say it's $100 a ton to make that commercially viable. Well, then that's where the CO2 price will actually settle out. Okay, so understanding those trade-offs, right, the different costs of capital, different costs of deploying different types of technologies is really, really critical to any of these types of analyses. The elasticity of supply of different fuels is very, very important as well. This is where natural gas potentially plays a very, very important role. the shale gale, as some people have actually referred to it, or the really rapid growth in shale development in North America, really stands to paint a new paradigm in energy markets in North America and globally. In effect, in North America, what we've had is a movement in the supply curve to one that was, relatively constrained. Right? We were actually seeing, limitations on what we could do if we just relied on conventional supplies, to one that's become very flat, right? For a very, very, very far out. So many, many trillion cubic feet at, a cost that doesn't really rise very much as you sort of move out the supply curve. So this is long-run supply, right? So when you think about that, and you think about the cost of moving to lower carbon fuels, this is actually a very, very important development. Because the more and more of these low-carbon alternatives you have, it sort of acts to put a limit on how rapidly CO2 prices will rise in any sort of scheme that you adopt. Obviously, elasticity of demand for energy matters. If demand is very inelastic, that means consumers don't respond to movements in price very much. Hence, you're going to have bigger CO2 prices to force adjustment. I basically said these things. The last point that I really haven't mentioned much is it has to do with the availability of new technologies. And almost every analysis out there makes some assumption about when a new technology will become available, and then they may actually test the waters with that particular assumption. So if we slide the date at which CCS becomes viable from 2015 to 2025, these types of things. And this is a pretty important driver as well, but again, it's not as important as the capital cost assumption, and hopefully that'll become clear. I don't know that this is entirely, how fuzzy is that slide? Can you guys see some of the numbers? Pretty fuzzy, yeah. All right, I'll just read a couple of numbers off to you. This is actually, there's a lot of insight in this. As I mentioned, we actually collected data from the Department of Energy, and this data is actually available off their website for the cost of, it's an overnight cost of deploying particular types of generation technologies. But then we actually collected from our Energy Forum members the costs of different types of generation technologies that our Energy Forum members happen to have very intimate knowledge of. And what you see among the conventional or the fossil fuel-based technologies is a dramatic disagreement between industry and the Department of Energy. So, for example, scrub new coal. The DOE puts it in $2,005 at roughly $1,900 a kilowatt. Industry puts it at over $3,000 a kilowatt. So that makes a pretty big difference when you're trying to figure out what types of capital to deploy, right? Another one that there's a really wide disagreement on is with nuclear power. Yeah. This one's actually the biggest of the lot in terms of the disagreement. The DOE data actually indicate that advanced nuclear power would cost about $3,100 a kilowatt. This again is in $2,005. But industry puts it at about $5,800 a kilowatt. So it's a factor of about 88% higher. Okay. So when you hear about analyses in which you hit a certain carbon price, and EIA's own analyses have done this, and you see lots of rapid deployment of new nuclear generation capacity, you have to keep in mind that that is based on this lower number, right? That analysis is based on a cost of $3,100 a kilowatt. So what you see in the analysis that we've performed at this at a much higher number when we use the industry cost, because by the way, we used both, okay? But when you use the industry cost, you don't see very much growth in nuclear power at all. It is a very cost-prohibitive option. Interestingly enough, and this is all at the bottom of the scale, if you look at wind, offshore wind, solar thermal, and photovoltaic technologies, the industry is generally lower cost than DOE. So if you think about what all this is sort of telling you at its face, right? The analysis that we do using the industry cost generally results in less nuclear deployment, less coal in the reference case, and more renewables longer term than, say, we would get using the DOE cost. So these are very, very important parameters to understand. Quick comment on the potential for gas to displace coal, because this is a very critical piece of the stories that we weave, right? What role is there for natural gas to actually displace coal in power generation and thereby help us achieve particular CO2 reductions? It's quite substantial, right? But the cost of carbon that's required to actually achieve particular reductions is very much dependent on the distribution of coal capacity by heat rate. Because basically what you're talking about as you start to raise the CO2 price is you shift the parity point between gas and coal at the dispatch point, right? You shift that more heavily to gas as the CO2 price rises. And the CO2 price has to rise continuously, right, continually higher if you want to displace more and more coal. Why? Because not all coal is old and inefficient. Some coal is actually quite new and quite efficient. So as you start to displace more and more coal, the CO2 price has to rise. And so that in itself is an interesting point, simply because if you do really aim to target displacing coal with natural gas in the power generation sector, you have to understand that as the CO2 price rises, right, you will actually encourage the adoption of other technologies as well. Right? So having a sort of single focus is not necessarily the right approach. The other thing to understand is that the fuel prices will change. If I'm discouraging the demand for coal and encouraging demand for natural gas, what do you think happens to the wholesale price of coal and the wholesale price of gas? Well, they move in the opposite direction. That tends to make the target carbon price for fuel parity higher. Okay, so just a couple of points that I wanted to sort of throw out there because it's pretty central to a lot of what falls out of the model. So we ran a number of different scenarios. This is a brief list of them. We ran a reference case. Amy referred to it earlier as a no policy case. That's a very good description. It's literally just load the data, get out of the way, and see what happens. Okay? We call that a reference case not because we believe that's the way the world will look, right? If none of these policies are adopted. Rather, it's the point that we refer to when we talk about incremental differences between cases. Okay, that's why we call it a reference case. We also run cases where we limit emissions to 80%, or it's a 20 by 50 case, so you cut emissions by 20% relative to 2005, but you don't allow offset trading. Then you run the same case where you allow trading in international offsets. Same thing, 50 by 50, 50 by 50 with offsets. It's just a deeper cut in CO2 emissions by 2050. Two cases where we implemented carbon taxes, largely because these are numbers that have been thrown around in discussion on the Hill and in broader discussions about the tax versus a cap and trade. Then we ran the case where electric vehicles and CNG vehicles, those are the next two in the list there, are forced to be achieve about 30% of the vehicle fleet by 2050, and then the renewable portfolio standards. And what I'm going to focus on in terms of the impact of renewables on this are basically four different cases. I'm going to talk about the reference case a little bit because I think you'll find it's going to be quite interesting when you see what actually happens to the deployment of renewables, even in the reference case. I know I did. Talk a little bit about the 50 by 50 with offsets case, the carbon tax 60 case, and of course the RPS case. Okay, so a small subset. There's more discussion on all these points in the longer paper. And quite frankly, writing the papers was very difficult because we're trying to pull out really high points, and there's so many different things that sort of fall out of this exercise. It's almost mind-boggling. But we also ran cases using the DOE and industry costs, so it's important to recognize that. What I'm presenting here uses only the industry costs. Right? I'm just picking something to focus on for now. I've basically said all this, so I'll just skip through. What happens to the CO2 price? Well, these are the cases where you have a price for CO2. The top line that's very, very sort of choppy is a 50 by 50 case, but there is no offset trading allowed. Okay? And what you have to understand in all of these cases that I'm showing you here, it's not just a U.S. target. Right? The 50 by 50 is a target for the U.S., but basically all the Annex 1 countries are included in that, and when we allow offsets, there's offset trading between those countries and so on and so forth. So, and actually carbon credits can be traded across all cases, so it's not actually a true offset. But what you'll notice, which again we found quite interesting, when you go from the 50 by 50 to the 50 by 50 offsets case, which is actually going from this line to this line, you get a lot sort of smoother trajectory with regard to price. So why is that? Right? It's because what offsets basically do is allow the supply curve for CO2 permits to be much more elastic. Okay? So you get much less volatility. So cap and trade design, when we think about offset trading, is very critical, particularly if we want to avoid potential adverse impacts of high volatility. right? Things that, in effect, make the supply of CO2 permits, that curve much more elastic, will actually benefit in terms of reducing the volatility of the carbon price. If you don't have that, though, you get pretty wild swings in the CO2 price, right? So that's very important. And, of course, you know, the carbon tax cases, those are pretty self-explanatory. The carbon price is exactly what it's set to be. CO2 emissions are obviously sensitive to policy design. You get the greatest cuts in emissions where, and this is in terms of actual emissions, where you have a 50 by 50 case with no offsets. So when you move to the offset case, you see that actual emissions, if I can get this mouse to work, shift from here to here. Okay? So that means that gap has to be filled by virtual or what we call net reducing sequestration projects, right, in effect. So, and by the way, investments in offsets are basically done through in multiple manners. You can invest in offsets in the energy industry directly. You can invest in forestry projects, or you can invest in non-CO2, in reducing non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And we actually use data from the EPA's own analysis of what these costs would be over time to inform those particular costs. So, energy demand, it turns out, is another very important offset in effect. When you start to raise the CO2 price, you actually do get a demand response. And so to the extent that you actually see a shift down in demand, that actually helps you meet the particular targets. Okay, so this is a cost, right, at its core. Certainly there are some gains with regard to improvements in efficiency and conservation that can be had, but a big chunk of the reduction in demand, for example, in the 50 by 50 case, which is this bottom line, comes because industry relocates. Right? There's a dramatic amount of carbon leakage when you see carbon prices in the $250 range. Okay, so that's actually a very important thing to consider. Do we really want to go to a 50% reduction relative to 2005 if we end up sacrificing a big chunk of domestic heavy industry? On net, globally, it doesn't actually make that big a difference. Why? Well, because all you're doing is shifting the industry from one part of the world to the next. Okay, so again, policy design is critical. Oil demand, it turns out if you really want to achieve dramatic cuts in CO2 emissions, you have to get into the petroleum sector. Right? You can hit the electric sector and you will get a certain degree of cuts, but if you want to get to this 50% plateau or 50% level, you've really got to start digging into the petroleum sector. And what that means is you've got to find a way to sequester CO2 from mobile source emissions. That is not an easy task. Basically, what ends up happening is you have to raise the price of CO2 to a level such that you promote the adoption of electric vehicles and you start to adopt carbon capture and sequestration in the electric generation sector so that you can, in effect, convert an automobile into something where the carbon is being sequestered at the power generation station. Okay, so that's what's happening in that particular case, which is why you see such a dramatic reduction in oil demand in the most severe cases. But it comes at a cost. In the power sector, generally everything's trending up. There's a lot of interesting things to say about the different cases, a lot of wiggles and different movements that you see. The one that's sort of the outlier that stands out is the case where we actually have very rapid adoption of electric vehicles. Because basically what you're doing is you're shifting demand out of the oil sector into the power sector. Okay? So that means, of course, you have to deploy more power generation capability, increased transmission, all these sorts of things. And in general, that tends to raise the price of electricity. But as Amy showed before, it's certainly not the most dramatic case in terms of increasing electricity prices. Largely because the EV case is, all the electricity is generated primarily by coal and natural gas. Right? We haven't actually put any carbon caps on in that case. All right? Certainly, if you want to layer sort of additional constraints, what it typically does is raise the cost. But we were looking at sort of one-offs in this analysis. So trends in the power sector. And here we can actually see what's happening with renewables. Renewables is this, and I'll read the numbers to you because I think this is interesting. Renewables is this green bit up here. Right, so I tried to color code this a little bit, right? Nuclear is the yellow, natural gas is the blue, and coal is over here. It's the gray. So currently around 49% electricity generation comes from coal. If you include hydro in the renewables basket, we're just under 10. Right? Natural gas is at about 21. Jump forward to 2020, and we can do this by case. I know these are difficult to read out there. In the reference case, renewables actually increased to about 11.8%. So there's growth in the reference case. And this is the no policy case, by the way. All right, we're not assuming any subsidies or anything like that. Okay? But there is growth. Natural gas growth expands by 5 percentage points in the reference case. If I go to the carbon tax 60 case, I actually see that renewables and natural gas both grow much more dramatically. Renewables achieve about 16 or 15.5% of total generation by 2020, and gas is up to about 37%, much at the expense of coal, which is down to about 27% of the generation fleet. Okay? If you go to the renewable portfolio standards case, renewables is a bigger share of the pie. Right, so we end up with roughly 18.3% of generation coming from renewables in that case. Natural gas has grown to about 24.4%. So it's not as much growth as in the reference case, but it's growth relative to 2010. Okay? Coal is hanging around more than in the carbon tax 60 case. Right? Coal's share of total generation is roughly 38%. The biggest impacts with regard to what happens to coal and all fossil fuels really are felt in the last case here, which is the 50 by 50 with offsets case. You don't really start to see those bind until you get out past 2020. Because we're ramping into this particular target of 50% reduction. So if I go to 2030, you can actually see in the reference case, natural gas is really taking off. Right? Lots of low-cost fuel available for power generation and very efficient generation units. In the renewable sector, you're a little over 14% now. If I go to the carbon tax 60 case, natural gas is still very large. Renewables is around 17.5%. The RPS, by far the biggest move in renewables, as you might expect. 28.6% of total generation in that case is coming from renewables. Natural gas is closing in on 30, and coal is basically taking the brunt of growth in those two fuels. Okay. 2040, the story gets even more dramatic, especially in the natural gas arena. Look at the reference case and the carbon tax 60 case. You're talking about over 40% of generation coming from natural gas. Okay. In the case where you have renewable portfolio standards, you don't get such dramatic growth in gas. In fact, you're only closing in on roughly 28.5%. Okay. But renewables is a pretty big chunk of the pie. Almost 33% of generation is coming from renewable energy sources, and coal's hanging on at about 23%. And then by 2050, of course, in the RPS case, you're closing in on 40% total generation from renewables. Gas really takes the brunt of the impact in the latter part of the time horizon, largely because we're using gas as we move along and the price is elevating. We haven't been using as much coal. The price has stayed suppressed. So coal hangs on. Gas starts to take the brunt of renewables growth, particularly late in the time horizon. In the carbon tax 60 case, you actually see renewables grow to about 24% of total generation. It's a pretty big share of the pie, particularly given now we're currently at about 9.5%. And even in the reference case, you approach 17.6%. All right, so one of the lessons that we sort of took away from this was that when you think about forcing an RPS standard onto the power generation sector, and again, you're only going to impact, I think it's roughly 40% of CO2 emissions if you only target electric generation. All right. If you force that RPS, and basically what you're doing is you're accelerating the timeline at which it would happen anyway. That's one of the key takeaways we took from this, because even in the reference case, where we have no policies, renewables start to make their way into the power generation mix. It's just not as dramatic as in the case where we force renewables. Now, I don't have this slide in this particular presentation, but Amy showed it to you earlier this morning. The cost of this particular exercise turns out to be quite dramatic. In terms of the change in electricity prices, the renewable portfolio standards case actually had the most dramatic impact on electricity prices of all the cases we considered. We actually found that to be startling. I wasn't expecting that when we started the exercise. But it turns out that you actually increase, relative to the reference case, the cost of electricity by more than a factor of 2. And in the reference case, you have to understand between now and 2050, we are showing that the price of electricity will basically double. So what you're talking about relative today is a price of power that's roughly 4 times what we see right now. So that's a pretty dramatic thing to sort of take on board and sort of internalize, right? We're going down this path where we're talking about a national renewable portfolio standard. But we have to understand at what cost we actually see that happen. It's not to say renewables aren't valuable. I mean, in the reference case even, we approach 18% of total generation by 2050, right? That's because it's winning on its own merits, right? When we pick a renewable portfolio standard or adopt such a case, we're actually picking winners, right? But we have to understand the cost of those particular policies. So with that, I'll just take some questions if there are any. And again, tomorrow I'm going to focus more on natural gas. I don't have much to say about that today, but. Hi, Marianne.
I probably should know the answer to this, but reference case, did you include the state renewable portfolio standards in there? Okay.
No, we did not. Again, it was literally, Amy characterized it very correctly by saying it's a no policy case. It's literally just get out of the way and the data are going to do what they're going to do. So.
I talk with people at the Electric Power Research Institute and the utilities all the time, and every single presentation I've ever seen them produce shows electric rates for the next many decades in comparison to most other fuels being stable or near stable. So where are the increased costs for renewables for electricity coming from?
Well, okay, first of all, there's a couple of points to address here. I was showing you data using industry costs, right? So relative to the reference case, you would think that this would actually generate a lower impact because industry is estimating the cost of deploying renewables is actually lower than what DOE estimates. Secondly, because in the cases where we use DOE costs, which I didn't show you, you have such a much lower cost of deploying coal and nuclear and even the natural gas generation technologies, you don't actually see an increase between now and 2050, but maybe of a couple of pennies in the price of electricity at the wholesale level. Okay. Now, when you go to the RPS case, there is a dramatic increase, but it's because you're forcing a higher cost source of generation onto the grid. I can back up a little bit. And I know this was impossible to see for you guys, and I really apologize about that. But if you just want to look at the cost, the overnight cost of deploying these technologies, right? Just to give you an idea in terms of the relativity, onshore wind is about $1,800 a kilowatt. If you go up here, that's comparable to coal according to DOE costs. All right. It's about $1,900 a kilowatt. If you compare that to advanced combined cycle, according to DOE, you're talking about $893 a kilowatt. So gas is a lower cost option than renewables, just at its overnight cost basis. And these are the DOE numbers that I'm quoting here. If you use industry numbers, advanced combined cycle is still less expensive because it's under $1,000 a kilowatt. Right? It's more expensive than the DOE, but it's still less expensive than renewables or wind. One of the other critical factors in determining how much, say, wind capacity you need to add really hinges on what you believe the load factors on turbines will be long term. So if there is any kind of dramatic technological change that increases, in effect, the reliability of wind turbines, then that will change the equation, right? So again, that's why I put so much emphasis on the assumptions, right? If I were to assume that the average load factor on wind goes from 26% to 50%, say in the state of Texas, well, you need to build less wind, the cost on the system will be lower, and wind will actually take a larger share at a lower cost. So there's a lot of things, I guess, behind the question you're asking.
Well, I'm truly not an expert in any of this, but like Texas wind, for instance, which is at night largely, are you assuming that the whole country moves gradually to a time of use, for instance? No. We haven't made any assumptions about, well, let me back up. What we've done with regard to the load duration curve, right, or the load curve, is we've actually looked at, and Peter's going to talk a little bit about this, one of my colleagues, Hartley, when he talks about wind later. We've actually looked at what the load factor on wind is given the load on the system, and we actually use that to statistically derive what the average load factor annually would be, because it's got to be related to what percentage of demand it can actually meet.
Because, for example, let's say the load factor for a wind turbine goes way up in the middle of the night. Well, that's when load on the system is lowest, so it actually brings the least amount of value to the system, right? So we've actually accounted for that.
Well, have you been, for instance, have you run this by utilities like Austin Energy, the largest renewable user?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was wondering about, I've looked at the MIT report on natural gas, Deutsch and Monitz, and from looking at their work, I notice you don't go past 2050. I don't know if it'd be feasible to do so. It looks like basically we go off a cliff at 2050. Natural gas, all the shale gas is used up, and I think Amy alluded to this as well, that especially if we want to get off oil, we're going to have to run our trucks on natural gas, and suddenly we're going to be buying all our natural gas and all our oil from the Middle East after 2050.
Right. Well, not to tip my hand too much for tomorrow, but a big chunk of uncertainty about when sort of natural gas goes off the cliff is related to what is the size of the resource base and at what cost can you access it. So you really have to look very carefully at the numbers that the MIT study used if you want to understand the sensitivity therein, right? It is certainly true that if we start to see a massive shift in the transportation sector, and this falls out of our analysis even, towards natural gas, you will actually incrementally increase demand in a dramatic way in the near term, right, over the next 10 to 20 years. Well, people often throw out this 100-year number, right? We have enough natural gas to provide supply for 100 years at current production rates. Well, that is the really critical part of the statement. Current production rates. So if I increase natural gas demand, let's say hypothetically by 25%, right? So add 5 TCF to the system and do that for 30 years. Well, what's 5 times 30? All right, it's 150 trillion cubic feet that we've just erased from the resource base. So what happens to demand is critical when you think about when we're going to have to start relying more and more on LNG imports. So you can't sort of take that, that temporality out of the equation because it's a very important part of it. The other thing to understand is we actually show in our work, and I'll talk about this again tomorrow, shale gas production continues to grow dramatically for a while. Where we see the declines is in other types of production. Right? The conventional resource base begins to become a smaller and smaller proportion of total production, and so you start to run into a wall there, right? Where really all your growth is net of losses in or declines in conventional basins, and so eventually we do turn to imports even in the reference case. But again, our own work indicates a technically recoverable assessment of about 600 trillion cubic feet. If you up that to 1,000, if you up that to 1,200, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in that number. So.
And I say made up about but sort of following that report, they said, well, we're going to switch to nuclear. Thing is, don't we also go off a cliff with U-235? That's when the U-235 all runs out.
Well, you'd be surprised how long that will last. But we actually looked at that. That's the timeline on that is much, much longer. But MIT's been pretty pro-nuclear for a long time, so.
Well, that's what I'd say, because I know they're pro-nuclear, and they say, look, we're going to go off a cliff on that as well, because China's going to build 1,000 nuclear plants, and there goes all the U-235. So.
No, certainly. I mean, when we talk about the depletable resource space, I mean, by definition, I preach this to my energy economics students, they're all transition fuels, because they don't last forever, right? So what you have to think about when you're trying to sort of model this and think about possible scenarios for the future is you have to understand, well, at what rate do we transition to different types of fuels? At what cost will that come? Should we be adopting policies that maybe try to pick winners or pick which one we'll transition to? And I think that's where we come out, particularly with regard to that question. Probably no. Because one of the things that I thought was very interesting is in the renewable space, the thing that long-term grows the most is geothermal. So just throw that out there. I guess
So I will encourage those of you who can come for both days to come for both days, only because some of the things that are being raised are in other papers. Very interesting paper on lithium and looking at that so-called, resource lock that the Bolivians were going to have on lithium, which, if you read the paper, we'll see is not so realistic. So a lot of times these resource assessments I have been hearing about our running out of this resource or that resource, and every time I put like I said, a group of undergraduates to call Berkeley or call, this one or that one and talk about industry companies and ask them what they're doing in a particular mineral or product or commodity, it always turns out this is a lot more complicated than what you're hearing as the sort of common wisdom. So we'll be hearing more and more about that over time. So our next presenter is Ten Tes-Zalides. He is our newest member of our energy economics team. He is a professor of economics. Before coming to Rice, he was at University of Minnesota and also at the Tippie School of Business at University of Iowa, University of Pittsburgh, and Wharton School. He has been an advisor in Europe to the EU and to the European Central Bank, and also for our Federal Reserve. And he has been working on issues related to the macroeconomy, and he's going to talk about that with us today.
Oh. Okay, yeah. Macroeconomists are supposed to be not entirely clear, so this fits very well. I'm delighted to be here and present this work to you. This is joint work with Peter Hadley, Ken Medlock, and Jinyang Jiang, who is one of the really talented graduate students here at in the economics department here at Rice University. This will be a little bit of a change in gears from the previous paper. As Amy said, I'm a macroeconomist. So we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at the macro economy, not necessarily incorporating an energy sector, which will surprise you to hear is something relatively new in macroeconomics, but not necessarily look at the same detail as typically done in an energy study. The question that we're looking at is, and we hear a lot about this these days, is whether R&D in renewable energy can act as an engine of macroeconomic growth. There's a lot of talk about this, both in the United States and Europe. Several countries in Europe, notably Spain, invested a lot adopting this premise. And we wanted to give it a rigorous look and see under what conditions this claims about the positive connection between R&D and renewable energy and growth, macroeconomic growth, under what conditions they hold, under what conditions they do not. Most studies indeed assume that the optimal studies of R&D in renewable energy is between 5 and 10% between 5 and 10 times the current level. And there's a proposal to spend $15 billion a year in renewable energy R&D here in the US over the next 10 years, compared to the $5 billion per year spent now. So our project is meant to inform the policy discussion using some rigorous modeling, and I'll talk a little bit about the modeling. I won't show you the equations, but I'll talk a little bit about how the modeling works, and study the effects of energy taxes and subsidies on macroeconomic growth. One important question when it comes to this is measuring technological progress. Adopting renewable technologies, making them competitive relies on the rates at which technological progress will emerge. And nobody has a crystal ball. How can you talk about the levels at which technological progress will emerge in the future? Scientists and engineers are working hard trying to get new innovations. Sometimes the ideas come, sometimes they don't. We think we have a good grasp on modeling this feature of technological progress, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this today. Historically, economists look at the mapping between R&D dollars and patents as a measure of technological progress. I'll talk a little bit about patents. We're going to end up using something else, a tool often commonly used by industrial engineers and operations research people called an experience curve. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take these experience curves and embed them into a macroeconomic model, calibrate that model, and study some policy scenarios. So this is how the talk will proceed today. apologize. This doesn't show well at all. We're looking at wind R&D in the wind energy, in the wind industry, and wind patents. These are the two graphs, top and bottom. And perhaps what is important to notice here is the negative trend. Okay, and more of the details on the graphs you can see in the paper, which you can find online, as Ken said. In fact, several people attribute a causality to this negative trend. So look at the graph up there that has wind R&D, and they say the declining trends in R&D dollars spent in wind R&D is what causes the declining trend in patents. You can see a similar picture, by the way, looking at solar. Solar R&D on top, and the bottom graph is solar patents. So this is one way of thinking about technological progress, right? How many patents are created. But we all know not all patents are equal. Some patents are very useful. The majority of them remain obscure and don't lead to much. Okay? One way of measuring the relative effectiveness of a patent is to see how many times this patent has been cited in the future. A little bit like scientific papers. We measure the effectiveness of scientific papers by looking at how many times there's a citation index that tells you how many times your paper has been cited in other published research. You can do the same for patents and try to infer by how many patents have used that patent in the future the relative effectiveness of that patent. So we do this here, actually. We look at patents that have been cited at least 3 times, and you'd be surprised. The majority of patents have been cited very close to 0 times. The way we're going to use to think about technological progress is experience curves. For several reasons. Partly, it's what I said first, which is it's hard to look at the number of patents and infer from that what this implies down the line about costs. Experience curves give you this relationship right there, and there's a very strong regularity in the data that I'm going to demonstrate there next. So it's a very good reason for using experience curves. Experience curves describe how costs decline with cumulative production, and they follow what's commonly called the power law. This is not an assumption. This is how the data looks like. Okay? A power law is described by this relationship. I don't know if you can read it. It says the price more appropriately, call it the cost in period T, is given by some initial cost, let's say the cost of producing the first megawatt of sales, the dollar cost of the first megawatt of sales, multiplied by X, which is cumulative production, raised to some power alpha. Alpha is a positive number. So this particular relationship implies that for each doubling of cumulative production or sales, the price declines to a fixed percentage of its previous value. And in fact, it holds very well for several technologies. This is an example of an experience curve for photovoltaic modules. And what you can see at the top, can you hear me? Can you hear me back there? Okay. What you can see at the top there is this is actual data. It's not made up. So it's really very rare for social scientists to see a law that is obeyed so well by a simple mathematical relationship. So you see declining prices. So for example, doubling production from 25 to 50, from 50 to 100, 100 to 200. The price drops to 82% of its previous value. Many times this relationship is plotted using log scale, in which case it looks very much like a straight line. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to use experience curves, as I said, in order to model technological progress. This will be a tool of predicting, if you want, using historical data, how progress is going to look like in the future, how costs are going to decline. And I'm going to talk about the specifics of the version of the experience curve we're going to use. And we're going to embed this in the macroeconomic model and let the model speak about when this technology will be adopted, what will this imply about costs, what will this imply about growth. Incidentally, this photovoltaic models, you can draw this for any technology you can think of, including wind, for example, or more established technology related to fossil fuel. What you will find in that case, perhaps unsurprisingly, more established technologies, you will find something that lies much lower than this, but it's also a lot flatter. Okay? All right. Let me tell you a few words. Again, I won't show you the equations, but I want to tell you a little bit about how our modeling works. We assume that production uses energy as an essential input. When it comes to fossil fuel, we assume that most easily mined or richest fields are exhausted first. Therefore, the marginal cost of extraction increase over time. But we also, and this is also often ignored in this kind of modeling, we allow for investment and technological change in the fossil fuel sector. So this allows for more efficient mining exploration. So diagrammatically, what you see is a cost curve like this, a relatively flat part, and then increasing dramatically as costs increase, as the extraction rates increase. But of course, technological progress allows you to move that vertical line more to the right, and you get an expansion more and more to the right. Of course, there's an ultimate limit beyond which technology won't get you any further. Resources on the planet are finite, and that's the ultimate limit, right? The model tells us that you're going to quit fossil fuel. You're going to make the transition towards renewable energy well before you reach that limit, and of course that makes perfect sense. But we do study technological change and technological progress in the fossil fuel sector. And in fact, we spend a lot of time, we talk a lot in the paper about how we calibrate that. We think we do a pretty good job calibrating that curve, that cost curve to actual data. When it comes to renewable energy, we assume that the marginal cost of energy, renewable energy declines as knowledge is gained through one of two ways, either through experience with the technology or direct investment in research. In fact, one of our policy experiments will be to subsidize that investment in research, which we interpret as a subsidy to R&D in the renewable sector, and see what this will do to some key macroeconomic variables. And having used this parameterization for technology, we are solving for what's called the optimal growth problem, which implies maximizing discounted welfare for the economy, let's say the US economy or the world economy, subject to constraints that involve budget constraints, technological constraints, and so on, and subject to the evolution of cost of energy. Evolution either through mining more scarce resources, therefore being more expensive, or through technological progress try to reduce these costs. For the engineers in the room, this amounts to an optimal control problem, a deterministic optimal control problem, where you're maximizing a functional and integral, describing welfare, subject to these constraints that are given by a set of differential equations and the corresponding initial and terminal conditions. So we solve that model using computational techniques, and here's what the model tells us. Again, probably you can't see this, so let me just read it to you. There are two main regimes. One where economic growth is fueled mainly through fossil fuel use, and after a transition, one where the economic growth is fueled mainly through renewable energy. In the first regime, there is up to a critical time T1, capital T1, which the model tells us what that is. We don't impose that. There is investment, there is fossil fuel use, and also there's investment in fossil fuels, in fossil fuel extraction in order to improve the technology and reach fields that weren't economically effective before. Also, once transition takes place and the economy moves to the state where renewable energy takes over, then again we have two periods. There is what they call the long run, the case where renewable energy is the main source of energy in the economy, but at the same time there is still technological progress and costs decline. And then there is a critical period, we call it T2, where the ultra long run, if you want, kicks in, where again minimum costs are reached and the economy has to move to something else or stay there, but at the minimum cost. There's no possible, the limits in technological progress are reached when it comes to renewable energy. So this is how the model looks like, the theoretical model looks like. We have to take the model to data. And the way we do this, we use a technique invented by Killen and Prescott in 1982 that led to a Nobel Prize in economics for them in 2004. And that method is called calibration. So the way we calibrate the model is by assigning numerical values to parameters so that the model is roughly consistent with facts, a variety of facts about the actual economy. And this technique allows for a rigorous study of what economists call general equilibrium effects, which I think are particularly important in this problem. That involves potential reallocation of growth and potentially jobs across sectors, and allows for the effect of policy across different sectors to be analyzed. Okay? If we are subsidizing, to make the point very, very simply, if we're subsidizing renewable energy, we are going to get some job in the renewable energy sector. There's no question about that. But the analysis shouldn't stop there. Should consider the potential of the job destruction in other industries and calculate the net effect. Okay? This kind of modeling allows you to do that. In terms of data sources, as I said, we do a fairly careful calibration, especially of the cost functions and the function associated with the way we describe learning and technological progress. Okay, so then we run the model, and here's what it gives us. We've run several parameterizations, and we're still playing with some of the details, but some of these results appear to be particularly robust, and these are the ones that I'm going to discuss with you today. The transition in the so-called laissez-faire economy, when there's no government intervention, okay, or any other frictions, any other taxes, or any way of interfering with economic growth. The optimal growth model suggests that the transition from the mainly fossil fuel regime to the mainly renewable energy regime will take place in 51 years. And the time where, the other critical time, where technological progress in the renewable energy virtually reaches its lower bound, this is in 131 years. To be perfectly honest, I'll take that second number less seriously when it comes to the description of the economy. To have an economist predicting what will happen 130 years in the future sounds like a bit like a contradiction. But that's what the model gives us. This really is not imposed. I want to emphasize that. The model could give us 2 years, or it could give us 3,000 years, but that's what comes out of the parameterization. In the first regime, the mainly fossil fuel regime, I present two curves here. You can find a lot of variables about that on our webpage. You see total investment in the economy, and this is investment in mining technology. So you see toward the end, more and more investment, in fact, increasing investments need to take place. So that technological progress in fossil fuel is effective. As a result, towards the end, some of the resources are taken away from investment in other sectors in the economy, and you see the investment declining. But this is part of the optimal response of the economy prior to the transition. Once a transition occurs, you see a investment in renewable energy increasing, and as a result, cumulative technological knowledge in renewable energy also increases. The shadow price of energy declines, and growth in this part is fueled through renewable energy sources, mainly renewable energy sources. Okay? So this is the solution to the optimal growth problem. Then we look at a variety of scenarios regarding policy, and I'm going to talk about two in particular today. The first we interpret as a tax on fossil fuel energy, and we see what this does, for example, to the critical day T1, prior to which, at which rather a transition occurs from fossil to renewable energy. So you see, absent any tax, as I said, this happens in 51 years. Again, I will read this because I don't know if you can see the numbers there. A 2% tax reduces that to 46 years, 5% tax, 45 years, 20% tax, something else has 20%, about 40 years. So taxing fossil fuel accelerates the adoption of renewable energy in the economy. It appears to be, the elasticity appears to be somewhat low. The total extraction of fossil fuel declines. I should add that this is accompanied by a slowdown in economic growth relative to the optimal growth problem, the solution to the optimal growth problem. So the tax creates a wedge between the equilibrium and the socially optimal investment. It does accelerate renewable energy adoption, however, at some cost to economic growth. Higher energy prices and a cost to economic growth. The second scenario I'm going to consider is a subsidy for renewable energy R&D. Again, we study subsidies corresponding to 2, 5, and 20%, and subsidies appear to be more effective in accelerating the adoption of renewable energy in our model economy. 2% tax from 51 to 34 years already, a 5% tax to 28, and so on. One thing to notice is this variable S stands for fossil fuel reserves used under subsidy, and somewhat surprising, at least to me when I looked at this first, these fossil fuel reserves are used more intensely under a subsidy to renewable energy. So one thing the model tells us is that subsidizing renewable energy could lead to short-run, more intensive use of fossil fuel, and although we don't model emissions in the model, to potentially higher emissions in the short run. Why is that? Remember, subsidy on renewable energy speeds up the adaptation of renewable energy compared to what is optimum. Okay? So as this adaptation comes earlier, the opportunity cost of using fossil fuel energy now versus in the future declines. Okay? If the fossil fuel regime is going to last for a shorter period of time, using that extra barrel of oil now versus in the future comes at a lower opportunity cost. So this is and Amy mentioned this earlier, some of these results surprised us, and this is one of them, that it can happen, and the results are non-negligible. It can happen that a subsidy on R&D and an earlier adaptation of renewable energy can in fact lead to a more intensive use of fossil fuel, at least in the short run. Okay, so to summarize, we calibrated a modeling that incorporates technological change via the use of experience curves and an explicit energy sector. It goes without saying that an energy sector should be part of the model for this audience, I'm sure. That's not a tradition in macroeconomics. So we think there's a contribution there. The model suggests that there are important general equilibrium effects. Taxes might disrupt socially efficient investments and, as a result, slow down economic growth. And these general equilibrium effects point out to the need to study models that consider all sectors and the aggregate economy as opposed to consider the effects of policy on one sector only. Once again, subsidizing one sector will definitely lead to an expansion and potentially a job creation there, but this does not mean that the net effect will be positive for the aggregate economy. The kind of model that we're using here allows us to consider these net effects. I should, of course, take the caveat here, and I should have said in the very beginning, our analysis does not consider emissions and climate change considerations, nor does it consider energy independent issues, partly because there's some disagreement about the values of these variables and they are hard to measure, partly because we wanted to take the argument about economic growth and the effect of subsidies on renewable energy on economic growth and study it on its own merits without considering national security and independence or climate change considerations. On that note, I will stop and open to questions. Thank you.
Our senior statesman, Peter Hartley. Peter, do we have the award you just won here in your bio yet? We probably didn't update it. What were you named this year? Senior, no, from the USA. He won the Senior Fellow Award for Excellence in Energy Economics and Contribution to the Field. He here at the Baker Institute is the George and Cynthia Mitchell Chair in Sustainable Development and Energy Economics. We are very proud to have him as a major member of our energy team. He has worked in a number of policy areas. I like to tell people there are some very prestigious programs, and I won't name them, that have other very prestigious economists that look at natural gas and electricity for various things, like the state of California and other places that have had serious deregulatory problems. I like to brag that Peter worked on the priorities review staff and the economic division of the Prime Minister's Department of the Australian government, and also assisted Queensland, two of the places where deregulation went very smoothly. So Peter is going to talk today about wind.
Thank you very much. Ted was talking about taking the analysis to the macro level. I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work underlying the model going down to a more micro level, and Ken, of course, is going to do that tomorrow as well, talking about gas. What I wanted to do is talk a little bit about wind, and this is, again, ongoing research. Let's see, which one of these? I should know by now. Ah, there we go. Know which one of these arrow keys works and which one doesn't by now. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about some aspects of wind generation. And as I say here, I'm going to talk a little, sort of focus my remarks on ERCOT in this talk. But if you get hold of the paper, you'll see that we also talk a little bit about MISO, the Midwest Independent System Operator. And some of the issues that I want to talk, Ken's already mentioned that part of the motivation for doing this work is input into the model that he and I are working on. But also it's of interest in its own sake, thinking about some interesting issues. How much capacity allowance should there be for wind generation, for example? And what type of plants is wind generation likely to displace? How might increased production of wind energy affect demand for other energy sources? And these are some of the issues I want to talk about. So here we have a sort of a graph of what's happened to generation from wind in recent years in the United States. And you can see there was a sort of almost like exponential growth. And we can ask why is wind generation growing so much? And one reason is summarised in this table, which comes from the EIA, which just summarises the large number of programs that are in place, that have policies in place that are encouraging the use, or production I should say, of renewable energy, from federal programs affecting tax, giving tax subsidies of various sorts, through a lot of state programs, local programs, even utility programs, for example, special rebates for renewable energy, multiple hundreds of these programs, and also some private programs. So you see a large number of programs in place to encourage renewable energy. So that certainly has been one factor leading to the growth in wind. Another factor, however, is that amongst renewable energy sources, which given the quality of the vision from down there, I put some effort into making the first part of this panel green background for renewable, but you probably can't see that. But in any case, this is just the EIA cost estimates that Ken's already talked about. And what you can see is amongst the renewable sources, wind is the lowest costs. So at the moment, if you're encouraging renewable, it's no surprise that would actually encourage wind because it's lower cost relative to the other renewables. But it's not the only reason, of course, why we've seen a big growth in wind. Another reason is that the United States actually has a lot of wind resources, and there's a bit of a lag here in the computer, and this really is the sand falling through the hourglass. Here, waiting for the next slide. I don't know what the story is there. I'll push the button twice, it's going to go. any case, what I show you is that, there we go. Now, of course, it went too far. This is a map from the NREL labs showing that actually the United States has a lot of wind resources. And actually, it's something that Ken and I discovered when we were looking through for the paper. We had to calibrate the available resources for all these different renewables. And it's pretty interesting. One thing that is true about the United States is that compared with a lot of other parts of the world, there's actually a lot of wind resource available in the United States right in the centre of the country. And you look at a lot of the rest of the world, actually the prime wind resources are around the coast. So here in the United States, you've got this bit right down the middle, next to the Rockies, where there's quite a large wind potential. So not only is it that the costs of wind are lower, you actually also have this very good wind resource. Of course, on the coasts, as we see, there also is even better wind resource, but also, as was pointed out this morning, some of the places where you would like to put wind as an engineer don't exactly make you popular. So we don't get it up there. One thing you can see here is the sort of looking at capacity by state, consistent with the picture I just showed you. A lot of the generation here is Texas, but also we have places like North Dakota, 7%, Minnesota, 8%, and so forth, Colorado, 7.7%. So all these states right down that middle part of the country, there's where a lot of the wind's being developed. And similarly, going in years after as we go through time. Okay, so what we did then was we wanted to look at exactly what are the consequences of the development of wind, and as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on Texas. And so I didn't know really what to expect here. We just gathered a bunch of data on wind generation in Texas over the last 3 years, and also we looked, as I mentioned, at MESO, but they're the two main areas where you have this wind capacity. And interestingly enough, in 2007, so this is just sort of a percentage of hours in the year where you have capacity utilisation of the winds. Here's the capacity utilisation along the bottom. So of all the wind generators, 20% of the generators are used roughly 1% of the hours, 20% of the generating capacity and so on. And the most likely outcome is actually that they're not used at all. So that when the wind's not blowing, right? And the maximum use is up to about 80%. So in a couple of hours, you get actually 80% of the capacity used. When you go to 2008, we actually had a better situation. You can see there were more of the capacity was used, sort of 40% of the capacity was used more hours. And if we go to 2009, now, even more, so a lot more of the capacity is being used, although, again, you've got to note the change in scale. This is still only 1.5% of the hours, up to 2% of the hours. The other thing that's important here I'm going to come back to is notice that there was a drop in the maximum capacity use. We can also look at that data using some summary statistics. And what we have here is that this is the mean capacity utilisation across the 3 years, 7, 8 and 9. And actually average capacity utilisation went up. This is, again, hour by hour. So on average, like 29.66% of the capacity is being used for an average hour in 2008. But then it went down again in 2009. But the other big thing we saw here was a big drop in the standard deviation. And that's associated with actually a movement, an increase in the minimum percentile and a decrease in the maximum. So you had this big drop in the range of capacity utilisations hour by hour. And the critical thing there, I think, is that we had much more, once you get more dispersion of the wind generators across different locations, the generation coming from those plants is much less highly correlated. So once you have more dispersion of the generators, you get a lower correlation. So that gives you both fewer hours when none of them are working, but also fewer hours when they're all working, and many more hours where, sort of on average, about half of them are working, so to speak. This drop in mean utilisation was highly statistically significant. And one reason for that drop in utilisation, as we saw from the previous picture, and for this I want to thank one of our research assistants, James Cohn, who did a lot of work on this for me. But one reason for the drop in utilisation in 2009 relative to 2008 was that there was a big increase in curtailment of wind generators in 2009. So 8% of the potential wind generation. So that means, given the speed of the wind, the output that could have been generated, the wind generators had to be turned off, well, they were turned off 8% of the time, or 8% of the potential output was not taken, I should say. And whereas in 2009, 17% was not taken. And part of that, of course, I'm going to talk about is because of the congestion of the lines, transmission lines coming from West Texas. But another reason was that the prices were very low in 2000. Some of the prices were very low in 2009, and a lot of the wind generators actually turned off their plants voluntarily when the prices were low. But that's certainly contributed to the reduction in average capacity factor in 2009, but it doesn't do all of it. And then, of course, there was some discussion about whether average wind speeds were lower in 2009 than 2008. Of course, statistically, we have a measure of how much the winds are varying by hour, and yet the change in capacity utilisation was still statistically significant. So, the question as to whether the average wind speed could actually account for a huge amount of this drop in capacity utilisation. Another reason where you might have seen it is because you would expect in any one area where you're putting in wind generators that people are going to put in the wind generator in the area where it's likely to be most productive first. And so then as time goes by, the sites are going to be on average less productive. So that alone would tend to suggest that the average capacity utilisation would fall. Of course, it's not entirely true because it could also be that you have transmission constraints and other things. So there could be a really terrific site that you can't develop because there's no transmission line. Down the track, when you put in the transmission line, then you'll be able to access those sites. But still, given where we have the lines going right now, in each area you'd expect the best sites to be used first. So one thing we did was we actually looked at the average wind speed at the locations where the new farms were built, and what we found was a statistically significant decline over this period, quarter by quarter, in the average wind speed. So that's consistent with this idea that you're exploiting the best sites first. Now so here's my point about the transmission line. So one thing to handle this transmission problem, the state of Texas has introduced this policy of competitive renewable energy zones, where everyone purchasing electricity in Texas is now paying a premium to pay for an expansion of the grid. And here's the expansion of the grid that's going to be put in place. That's going to enable these wind resources from West Texas to be brought into East Texas, where most of the demand is. Another factor that's important apart from the average capacity utilisation that we're interested in is when is that wind actually produced? And because that determines both the value of putting in a wind generator, because when it's produced is related to the price you get, but also, it depends, it influences like the capacity value, how much you're going to value that wind capacity in terms of providing peak power. So to investigate that issue further, we looked at what the statisticians call a joint probability density function. We estimated here for both wind capacity measured on this axis and the load on the system measured on this axis. So what we did is we looked at if you like, sort of the correlation between when the wind generation is occurring and how that's related to the system load. And what you find is that most of the wind generation here is occurring when the system load is about 50%, the ERCOT load. 100% would be far out here to the left. And you can see when the load on the system is very, very high, so we're at peak periods, the wind is not blowing very much. So this is very, very flat. So this ridge will show you that when the system load is 50%, and some of these hours actually we have no wind use, but the only times when the wind generation is very high, that's toward the front of the picture, the system load tends to be about 50%. As we continue on into the subsequent years, I showed you on the previous graph, we started to get more hours where wind was used more extensively, but unfortunately they also tended to be hours when the system load was about 50%. So even though we've got more wind capacity being used here, it's not so much up here on the left where the load on the system is very high, although there's a little bit of that as well, you can see from these bumps appearing. And continuing on to 2009, again that got emphasised even more, and so a lot of this extra wind capacity is actually adding at a time when the system load is not very great. We can look at that in another way by estimating sort of a systematic pattern relating trying to find out what's going on. So we did a regression analysis of wind generation by hour, and rather than go through all those tables of numbers, which you probably can't see anyway, I put them on this graph. And what this shows is that this time here is the middle of the afternoon, which is when the demand for electricity is very high in Texas because of demand for air conditioning in the middle of the afternoon. And as was already mentioned earlier, what we tend to find is that the wind is generating the highest capacity factors at the middle of the night. This is midnight, here and midnight again, and lowest during the day. What we do see here is over time, fortunately, this curve has filled in a little bit. So this is 2009, this is 2008, the blue is 2007. But actually, part of the story there, it turns out, may be the curtailment, because exactly when the wind generation is curtailed is going to be in the middle of the night, because that's where these lines get congested. So what that's done is reduce the generation of electricity at the middle of the night, whereas in the daytime, when these generators aren't producing so much, you're much less likely to have congested lines. So part of the explanation for this increase is probably the congestion. That's borne out by the analysis in MESO, by the way, which I don't have here, but it's in the paper, where the similar curves go the opposite direction, and in MESO we didn't have congested lines leading to curtailment. So that sort of supports the idea that part of this is because of the curtailment issue. So what that may mean is that as we build out those lines, we're going to go back more to a pattern of wind generation being much stronger during the day. So basically this puts in words what I just said. The one thing to say here is that the large wind output at night when the system demand is low contributed to negative prices. And you might say, what's a negative price? So a negative price is where the generator pays the customer to take the power off their hands. They're saying, take it away, get rid of it, please. So what's going on is, it turns out there's a large number of hours. So if we look at this, prices were negative in about 1% of the 15-minute market intervals in 2007 in ERCOT, 14% in 2008, 8.8% in 2009. So a fair chunk of the hours the prices were negative. Actually, for a lot of times, the negative price basically amounted to our estimate of what the wind subsidies to wind were worth. So the generators are willing to pay up to a penny less than their subsidy in order to be allowed to continue to generate. That's why they'll pay you to take the power off their hands, right? So they're basically paying you the subsidy, keeping a penny for themselves. And some of the times, actually, we had extremely negative, like minus $1,000. What's going on there, of course, is that we have to curtail output so much that we're cutting into the output from the coal and nuclear plants. And the coal and nuclear plants is very, very expensive to shut them down. So they're bidding in a very negative price. They're saying, we would prefer to pay $1,000 rather than be shut down. But what ends up happening is that we actually then ask them to shut down. We've got to pay, so they end up being the marginal plant, and so the price ends up being minus $1,000. If we then focus on this issue of the capacity value of wind, I showed you some statistics from the distribution of wind generation use for all hours of the year. What we did here was focus in on the top 5% of the hours and the top 1% of the hours by ERCOT system load. And what you find is that as you focus in on more and more of the peak hours, the average capacity utilisation of the wind generators actually falls. So in 2008, for the top 1% of the hours, it was 14%, again 14% in 2009. The ERCOT, it turns out, counts 9% of wind capacity as when they're sort of measuring how much wind contributes to peak generation, meeting the sort of need for capacity at peak times. If you take that as a measure like 9%, so it turns out the wind actually generates less than 9% of its capacity 25% of the time, 25% of the top 5% of hours, and about also 25% of the top 1% of hours. So in other words, what we're saying is if we make a capacity allowance of 9% for wind, 25% of the time wind won't actually be supplying 9%. It'll be supplying less than 9%. So there's a 1 in 4 chance that it wouldn't actually be supplying that 9%. Of course, there's a 3 in 4 chance it'll be supplying more than that. But if something else happens at the time and the wind's not blowing, there's a certain risk there. So I myself would think I'd be concerned if ERCOT, some people are urging ERCOT to raise that 9%. But if you start to raise it, like if you even go to 15%, there's a 1 in 2 chance you wouldn't actually have that much output from the wind at the peak. Another factor of wind, of course, is the intermittency. At the moment, we don't have very good storage, very economically competitive means of storing electricity. So, and ramp up and ramp down events, sort of sudden increases and decreases in wind speed, actually cause difficulty for operating the system. And one thing that has happened, we've seen in Texas, is actually that this need to cycle plants in response to the wind generation has actually imposed costs on both the coal and the natural gas generators. And actually, it also puts a premium on accurate wind forecasts. So it turns out that the amount of power you get from the wind generation in the optimal part of the curve goes as the cube of the wind speed. And an implication of that is that a given percentage change in wind speed leads to a more than 3 times percentage change in wind output. So if the wind speed varies by 5%, the wind output will vary by more than 15%. Wind speed varies by 20%, the wind output will vary by more than 60%. So it places a really high premium on getting accurate forecasts of wind speed. And in the early days, ERCOT had trouble with that. They're improving, but it's still some difficulty. Now, in terms of, I've only got a few minutes left, so the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is what do we think the wind capacity will do to the demand for other fuels, although to do this properly you have to do this kind of model that Ken was talking about. But one thing that we do find is that because the wind's blowing at night, what it tends to do is reduce the demand much more at the off-peak time than at peak time. So it hardly contributes at all to the peak and contributes a lot more to the off-peak. So it rotates the load, what's called the load duration curve, rotates it around in a clockwise direction. And you can see that that effect increased over time. And a consequence of that is that the wind actually takes away more from the base load than it does from the peak. And a little bit of analysis, so I went through a little, just a little example, but the basic point is that if you, I can summarise it in this picture, that basically if you take 2 kinds of generators, the base load plant that has high capital cost, low operating cost, peak load plant that's the opposite, low capital cost, high operating cost, that you can show sort of economically that what you want to do is basically you want to use the base load plant throughout, but you only want to use this peak load plant for the peak period if you're designing the system optimally. And so what that means is that if you have wind taking away demand in the off-peak period, that basically it's going to, but less so in the intermediate period, it's going to take away more of the base load capacity than the peak capacity. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to affect gas demand more than coal demand, however, because the point is, of course, that the gas plant is a much better complement for the wind, where you have these ramp up and ramp down events. So if you have more wind, you're actually going to have more gas capacity, but you're going to be using the gas capacity much less. So you're going to build the extra gas capacity to complement the wind, but whenever the wind's blowing, you're not actually using the gas capacity. So the net effect on the demand for natural gas, on the one hand, you tend to build more plants, but on the other hand, you probably run them at a lower capacity factor. The other thing is that you probably build gas turbines instead of combined cycle plants. And so the gas turbines, of course, are less efficient than the combined cycle plants, and that also has an impact on natural gas. So when you're actually using the gas turbines, you're using more gas than you would otherwise. So at the end of the day, what's it say exactly about the fuel use? You can't really say. It all depends on the exact configuration of the system and probably changes over time, as Ken emphasised. So basically that's bottom line. There's some meso slides there if anyone has any questions about that. I'll take any questions. No?
Okay.
Good.
I think we've earned a coffee break. Okay, we will take a quick 10-minute coffee break, and then we will finish the session with our international issues.